The story of Interstellar begins in a future Earth that is slowly collapsing under the weight of environmental destruction and failing agriculture. Humanity is no longer expanding toward the stars but instead shrinking into survival. Dust storms dominate the skies and farmland is becoming less productive year by year. The world is no longer driven by exploration but by necessity and survival. In this environment we are introduced to Cooper, a former NASA pilot who is now living as a farmer. He is a man shaped by both engineering intelligence and emotional conflict. He represents the last generation that still remembers when humanity reached upward instead of inward. His life seems grounded in routine, but beneath that surface there is a constant sense of loss and curiosity. He lives with his father-in-law and his two children, Tom and Merv, in a world where dreams of space travel are considered outdated fantasies. Merv is a key emotional anchor in the beginning of the story. She is intelligent, observant, and deeply attached to her father. She believes that there is something hidden in their house, a kind of mysterious pattern in dust that behaves like communication rather than coincidence. Cooper initially tries to dismiss it as imagination, but his scientific mind is unable to ignore patterns that repeat with mathematical precision. This becomes the first subtle connection between human intuition and unknown intelligence that seems to be influencing their world. The dust patterns eventually lead Cooper and Merv to a hidden location that reveals something that should not exist in their time. That discovery leads them to what remains of NASA, now operating secretly due to political and social conditions where space exploration is considered a waste of resources. Inside this hidden facility, Cooper meets Professor Brand, who explains the reality of Earth's condition without emotional filtering. The planet is dying and humanity has limited time before survival becomes impossible. The only hope is not to save Earth but to leave it entirely. This idea shifts the entire direction of the story from preservation to migration. Cooper is presented with a choice that defines the emotional core of the film. He can remain with his children and watch Earth collapse, or he can become part of a mission that may save humanity but separate him from his family forever. At this point the film introduces the concept of the Lazarus missions, which sent astronauts through a wormhole near Saturn that appeared mysteriously years earlier. This wormhole is not just a scientific phenomenon but a doorway to another region of the universe where potentially habitable planets exist. The idea of unknown civilizations or higher intelligence placing this wormhole becomes a silent question that runs through the entire film. No one knows who created it or why, but it has changed the fate of humanity. Cooper ultimately chooses to join the mission not because he is free from emotional attachment but because he understands the scale of what is at stake. This decision is one of the most painful parts of the narrative because it is not heroic in a simple sense. It is a sacrifice built on logic and love at the same time. He promises Merv that he will return, but both of them understand that time itself will not behave normally once he leaves Earth. The launch sequence marks a shift in tone from grounded Earth reality to vast cosmic uncertainty. As the spacecraft Endurance leaves Earth's atmosphere, the film moves into silence and scale, showing the fragility of human existence compared to the universe. The docking and space travel scenes emphasize precision and realism rather than fantasy. Every movement is calculated and every failure carries consequences. This establishes the film not as pure science fiction spectacle but as a grounded exploration of theoretical physics and human emotion combined. As they approach Saturn, the appearance of the wormhole becomes one of the most visually and conceptually powerful moments. It is shown not as a tunnel but as a spherical distortion in space-time. The crew crosses it with uncertainty, knowing that they are leaving everything familiar behind. This moment is symbolic of irreversible transformation. Once they enter, communication with Earth becomes delayed and eventually distorted due to relativity effects and distance. Inside the wormhole they arrive in another galaxy where multiple potential worlds orbit a supermassive black hole named Gargantua. This introduces the central scientific theme of the film, which is gravitational time dilation. Time does not move equally across all planets and environments. Near strong gravitational fields, time slows dramatically compared to Earth. This means that hours on one planet can equal years on Earth. This concept is not just scientific background but emotional structure because it determines the fate of relationships between Cooper and his daughter Merv. The mission splits into exploration phases where different planets are evaluated for habitability. Each planet represents a different outcome of cosmic conditions and human expectation. One appears covered in water with massive tidal waves and extreme gravitational effects. Another appears frozen and lifeless. Each exploration carries heavy cost in time and human life, reinforcing the idea that space exploration is not romantic but brutally expensive in terms of survival and aging. As the journey continues, Cooper begins to feel the emotional consequences of time distortion. Messages from Earth show his children growing older without him. Merv becomes more distant emotionally while also becoming increasingly intelligent and determined to solve gravitational equations left by Professor Brand. The relationship between father and daughter becomes strained not by choice but by physics itself. This is where the film transforms from a space exploration story into a deeply emotional study of separation caused by time. The Endurance crew slowly realizes that survival is not just about finding a new planet but also about understanding whether humanity deserves or can achieve continuation. Trust begins to break within the team as isolation and uncertainty increase psychological pressure. Cooper remains focused on the mission while also carrying the emotional burden of his promise to return to Merv. The journey deeper into the unknown begins when the Endurance crew finally commits to the first real planetary exploration. The sense of anticipation is not built on hope alone but on desperation, because every decision they make is tied to the survival of an entire species that has already lost its home. The ship drifts toward the first candidate world orbiting close to the black hole Gargantua, a planet that had been previously marked by earlier explorers as potentially habitable. What makes this destination both promising and dangerous is its extreme proximity to the gravitational field that bends both space and time in unnatural ways for human experience. As they descend toward the ocean planet, the environment immediately communicates instability. There is no land in sight, only an endless reflective surface of water that stretches beyond the horizon, giving the illusion that the planet itself is not solid but fluid in structure. The silence is heavy, not peaceful, but observational, as if the planet is waiting to respond. The crew lands cautiously, fully aware that even minor miscalculations could cost them everything, but what they do not yet fully grasp is that time itself is not behaving in a way that matches their expectations. This planet reveals one of the most scientifically and emotionally devastating principles in the entire narrative: gravitational time dilation. Due to the intense gravitational pull of Gargantua, every hour spent on the surface of this water world translates into years passing for those left in orbit or back on Earth. At first this concept exists only as theory explained through calculations and assumptions, but reality becomes far more brutal once it is experienced directly. The mission that was supposed to take hours suddenly becomes a trap where minutes are no longer reliable measurements of consequence. The exploration team moves carefully across the water surface, but the environment itself soon becomes an active threat. Gigantic tidal waves rise without warning, not shaped by wind but by gravitational forces pulling the entire ocean into motion. These waves are not simple natural disasters but expressions of planetary physics operating at a scale far beyond earthly storms. The tension builds not through chaos but through inevitability, as the characters realize that the planet is not hostile in intention but indifferent in structure. When the first massive wave arrives, it reshapes the entire understanding of risk. Survival becomes a matter of timing, distance, and reaction measured in seconds rather than minutes. The wave is not just water but momentum on a planetary scale, a wall of force that erases everything in its path without hesitation. The crew's struggle is not heroic in the traditional sense but mathematical, a desperate attempt to align human limitation with cosmic mechanics. Every decision is reduced to precision under pressure. What makes the sequence even more devastating is what happens outside the planet. While the crew experiences only a few hours of chaos, years are silently passing for Merv on Earth. Cooper is unaware that every moment of survival on the water world is simultaneously a moment of irreversible loss in his personal life. The emotional cost is not immediate but delayed, which makes it far more painful when it is eventually revealed. When the team returns to the spacecraft after surviving the planet's extreme conditions, they discover the truth about time dilation. Messages from Earth are no longer simple updates but fragments of entire lifetimes. Murph is no longer a child but an adult shaped by years of absence and unresolved emotional weight. The realization that time has been stolen from them without consent creates one of the most psychologically intense moments in the narrative. Cooper does not just lose time, he loses the ability to participate in his daughter's growth. The emotional tone shifts dramatically here because survival in space no longer feels like progress. It begins to feel like erosion. Every successful mission comes with invisible consequences that cannot be reversed. The crew begins to understand that the universe does not reward effort with fairness. It only continues its own laws without regard for human attachment. At this stage, trust within the crew begins to weaken. Each member carries different interpretations of what success means and what sacrifice is acceptable. The idea of returning to Earth becomes less realistic and more philosophical. The mission is no longer just about finding a new home but about redefining what home even means when time is no longer shared equally across distances. Cooper himself begins to experience internal fragmentation between his role as an astronaut and his identity as a father. His decisions are guided by logic required for survival, yet emotionally anchored in a promise that is becoming increasingly impossible to fulfill. The film uses this conflict not as dialogue but as silence, pauses, and visual emptiness between communication delays. The Endurance crew prepares to move forward toward the next potential world, but the weight of what they have already lost follows them into every calculation. Nothing in space is forgotten, but everything is delayed, and that delay itself becomes a form of emotional punishment. The mission continues forward with a growing sense that every choice now carries irreversible consequences, not only for the people inside the Endurance but for humanity itself. After the devastating experience of the first ocean world, the crew is no longer operating with optimism. Instead, they are functioning under emotional fatigue, scientific urgency, and a quiet fear that the universe may not offer any stable solution to their problem. Yet the mission cannot stop, because stopping would mean accepting extinction as inevitable. Their next destination is the ice world associated with Dr. Mann, one of the earlier Lazarus mission scientists who was sent ahead to evaluate planetary conditions and transmit data back to Earth. Among all the candidates, his planet had shown the most promising signals of habitability. It is cold, silent, and seemingly stable, a frozen landscape that appears less violent than the ocean world they just escaped. However, in space exploration, appearances are not truth, they are only surface conditions hiding deeper realities. As they approach the ice planet, there is a psychological shift in the crew. Hope begins to re-enter the conversation, but it is a fragile hope built on exhaustion rather than certainty. Dr. Mann had been considered one of the most reliable scientists from the original Lazarus missions, and his data had been a guiding reason for selecting this world as a priority target. In theory, this should be the moment where survival becomes more realistic again. In practice, however, isolation has already begun reshaping human judgment in unpredictable ways. When they land on the frozen surface, the environment is striking in its emptiness. There is no visible life, no movement, only an endless cold horizon that reflects light in muted tones. The silence here is different from the ocean world. It is not tense or active, but hollow. It gives the impression that nothing has ever truly lived here, or that anything that once existed has been erased entirely. The crew begins to explore cautiously, following the coordinates left behind by Dr. Mann's signals. Soon they locate what appears to be the habitat structure built by him, partially buried in ice and surrounded by harsh terrain. Inside, they find Dr. Mann himself, in a state of physical weakness but alive. At first this discovery brings relief. The assumption is that survival on this planet, though difficult, is possible. Dr. Mann initially presents himself as a scientist who has endured extreme conditions and managed to preserve his life through determination and discipline. His reports continue to support the idea that the planet could be a viable candidate for human habitation. However, beneath this surface narrative lies a much more complicated psychological reality. Isolation in space does not only test physical survival but reshapes perception, identity, and truth itself. Dr. Mann has been alone for an extended period, receiving no meaningful confirmation that rescue or follow-up missions are coming. The data he originally sent back was based on incomplete understanding and increasingly desperate interpretation of his environment. Over time, the boundary between objective science and emotional survival has blurred within him. The truth begins to unravel when inconsistencies appear in his data and behavior. The planet, rather than being stable and habitable, is revealed to be far less suitable for long-term human life than originally reported. The signals he transmitted were not entirely honest. They were shaped by psychological desperation, a need to be found, a need to justify his continued existence in isolation. This revelation introduces one of the most critical themes of the entire narrative, that human survival instinct can distort even scientific truth when the cost of failure becomes unbearable. Dr. Mann's character becomes a representation of a deeper philosophical question. What happens when a human is placed in absolute isolation with the responsibility of determining truth for an entire species? The pressure does not simply break him, it reshapes his definition of reality. Survival becomes more important than accuracy. Hope becomes more important than honesty. And eventually, even false data begins to feel justified if it leads to the possibility of rescue. The situation escalates when his deception is confronted, leading to a collapse of trust within the mission. The environment itself begins to react violently, revealing that the planet is not as stable as it appeared. The ice and terrain become unpredictable, reinforcing the idea that even physical reality in space exploration can feel hostile when combined with human error and emotional breakdown. What follows is not just a scientific failure but a psychological and structural collapse of trust. The crew realizes that one of their most trusted data sources has been fundamentally corrupted by isolation. The mission, which already carried enormous uncertainty, now faces internal instability from within its own ranks. Cooper, who has consistently operated with a focus on mission survival and long-term outcome, is forced into a position where he must balance truth, survival, and immediate danger. The presence of Dr. Mann becomes not just a scientific liability but a moral and existential crisis. The idea that humanity's survival could depend on information that was never reliable introduces a devastating uncertainty into the entire journey. This part of the story deepens the central theme of Interstellar, that space is not only a physical frontier but a psychological one. The further humanity moves from Earth, the more fragile its internal structures become. Truth, trust, and identity begin to degrade under isolation and time distortion. As tensions rise on the ice planet, the mission transitions from exploration to survival once again, but this time the enemy is not nature alone. It is also human fear, human ego, and the inability to remain objective under extreme conditions. The fragile balance that had been holding the mission together finally begins to collapse on the ice planet when Dr. Mann's deception fully reveals itself. What had initially appeared as a moment of scientific recovery quickly transforms into one of the most dangerous turning points in the entire journey. The illusion of a viable world was never grounded in reality but in the psychological survival of a man who had been alone for far too long. Now that illusion has consequences far beyond personal failure because it threatens the continuation of the entire mission. Dr. Mann's desperation becomes the central force driving the conflict. Once confronted with the truth that his data is invalid and that the planet is not suitable for long-term human survival, he shifts from defensive explanation to survival instinct at any cost. At this stage he no longer behaves as a scientist or explorer but as a human being stripped of social accountability and operating under pure instinct. The arrival of Cooper and the crew does not represent rescue to him anymore but judgment, and more importantly, the end of his only remaining chance at relevance or survival. This psychological pressure leads him to make a catastrophic decision. Instead of accepting failure, he chooses to manipulate the situation in a way that will allow him to escape the planet and continue the mission under false pretenses. He attempts to take control of the situation, triggering a chain of events that results in severe damage to the endurance system and placing everyone in immediate physical danger. The environment of the ice planet itself, already unstable and harsh, becomes secondary to the human conflict unfolding inside it. What follows is not a traditional confrontation but a breakdown of control. Dr. Mann's attempt to dock manually with the Endurance without proper synchronization leads to a violent failure. The docking mechanism, which requires precise alignment and timing, becomes the center of one of the most tense sequences in the entire narrative. The ship begins to spin uncontrollably in space due to the compromised docking procedure, turning what should have been a controlled approach into a life-threatening orbital disaster. Inside this chaos, Cooper is forced into a situation where instinct, experience, and calculation must merge in real time. The Endurance is no longer a stable mission vessel but a rotating object losing structural control. Every second increases the likelihood of total mission failure. The laws of physics become both the obstacle and the only possible solution. There is no external rescue, no backup system, only the ability to understand motion, rotation, and relative velocity in a rapidly deteriorating environment. This is where the film shifts into one of its most technically grounded and emotionally intense sequences. The spinning spacecraft represents not just physical danger but symbolic loss of control over human ambition. The mission that was designed to be precise and calculated is now spiraling literally and metaphorically into chaos caused by human error and emotional collapse. Cooper's response is not panic but calculation under extreme pressure. He understands that the only way to regain control is not to fight the spin directly but to match it, to become part of the system temporarily in order to correct it. This idea reflects one of the deeper scientific philosophies of the film, that survival in space is not achieved through resistance alone but through understanding and adaptation to the environment. The docking scene becomes a moment where human intuition and physics merge into a single survival mechanism. Every movement is governed by timing and alignment, where even the smallest miscalculation can result in total destruction. The communication between crew members is minimal because verbal coordination is no longer sufficient. Instead, the decision-making becomes almost entirely internal, driven by awareness of motion and consequence. At the same time, Dr. Mann's presence during this crisis adds another layer of tension. His actions have already compromised the mission, but now he is physically part of the disaster he created. His attempt to force success through deception reaches its final consequence as the situation escalates beyond his control. The environment he tried to escape from now becomes the stage of his failure. As the docking sequence continues, the Endurance reaches a point where structural stability is nearly lost. It is at this moment that Cooper executes the critical maneuver that allows temporary alignment with the rotating station. The physics of angular momentum and matching rotation become the only path forward. Instead of fighting the spin, he synchronizes with it, allowing the docking process to complete at the precise moment when relative motion becomes momentarily stable. The success of this maneuver is not presented as triumph but as survival under extreme conditions. There is no celebration, only relief mixed with exhaustion. The spacecraft is no longer in danger of immediate destruction, but it has been permanently altered by the event. Trust within the crew has been further eroded, resources have been reduced, and time itself continues to function as an invisible threat. Dr. Mann's storyline reaches its conclusion in the sequence as well, marking the end of his role in the mission. His character represents the breaking point of human isolation, where long-duration survival without connection leads to distortion of truth. His failure is not purely moral or technical but psychological, shaped by conditions that exceed normal human resilience. After the crisis, the Endurance is left damaged but functional, drifting in space with limited options remaining. The crew now faces a critical decision about the continuation of the mission. Earth is still far away, communication is limited, and the remaining viable planet options are becoming fewer. Every remaining choice carries the weight of irreversible consequence. Cooper and the remaining crew must now confront a reality where survival is no longer about exploration but about selecting the least impossible outcome. The emotional weight of the mission increases because every step forward also represents a further distance from Earth and from Murph, whose life continues to move forward in time without him. The narrative at this stage transitions fully from exploration science fiction into existential survival drama. Space is no longer an unknown frontier filled with discovery but a vast environment where every action is constrained by physics, time, and emotional cost. After surviving the collapse caused by Dr. Mann, the Endurance is left in a fractured state, both physically and emotionally. The crew is no longer operating under the illusion of exploration or discovery. What remains is a narrowing path toward survival, and even that survival is uncertain. Every system on board the spacecraft has been stressed, every assumption about trust has been broken, and every remaining option now feels like a compromise between impossible outcomes rather than a clear solution. At this point, the gravitational pull of Gargantua becomes not just a destination in space but the central force shaping every remaining decision. The black hole is no longer a distant scientific object but a presence that defines time, gravity, and emotional distance simultaneously. Its influence on surrounding planets has already been established, but now it becomes the final stage of the mission itself, where the remaining answers to humanity's survival may or may not exist. The crew realizes that returning to Earth in any traditional sense is no longer feasible within the constraints of fuel, time, and physics. The mission has effectively transitioned from exploration into a binary survival equation. Either they find a viable solution near Gargantua or humanity on Earth continues toward extinction without intervention. This realization removes all remaining emotional safety nets and forces decisions that are no longer guided by hope but by necessity. Cooper, however, is still emotionally anchored to Earth in a way that the others are not. His connection to Murph continues to define his internal conflict, even as time dilation has already turned their relationship into a fractured memory. Every calculation he makes is influenced by both scientific reasoning and emotional consequence. This duality makes him both the most capable and the most burdened member of the crew. As the Endurance approaches the final stages of its journey near Gargantua, the crew confronts the most critical limitation of their entire mission, the lack of fuel and the inability to support all remaining objectives. The spacecraft cannot simultaneously achieve both survival for the crew and transmission of critical data back to Earth that could allow humanity's salvation. This creates a structural conflict where sacrifice becomes unavoidable, and every possible path requires loss. It is at this moment that the idea of entering the black hole itself becomes a calculated decision rather than an abstract fear. The presence of the gravitational anomaly suggests that within Gargantua there may exist conditions or phenomena that could allow transmission of quantum data back across dimensions or gravitational boundaries. This idea, though highly theoretical, becomes the last remaining possibility for saving Earth. The crew divides not physically but ideologically. One path prioritizes survival and continuation away from the black hole, while the other prioritizes sacrifice and direct engagement with it in order to transmit data that could solve the gravitational equation needed to evacuate humanity. This division is not based on disagreement alone but on different interpretations of responsibility. Cooper ultimately becomes the central figure in this decision because of his unique combination of piloting skill, scientific understanding, and emotional motivation. He understands that survival without solution leads nowhere meaningful, and solution without survival is equally incomplete. The only remaining meaningful action is one that may cost his life but preserve the possibility of saving others. The spacecraft sequence leading toward the black hole is marked by increasing gravitational distortion and visual instability. Space itself begins to behave differently, light bends in unnatural arcs, and time becomes less predictable even within the ship's controlled environment. The approach to Gargantua is not a simple trajectory but a gradual surrender to gravitational dominance. At this stage the emotional weight of the narrative becomes overwhelming. Cooper's internal conflict reaches its peak because he is no longer making decisions for a mission but for a future he may never witness. The promise he made to Murph becomes both motivation and burden, because every step closer to the solution also increases the distance between them in irreversible ways. The crew prepares for separation as the mission splits into its final irreversible action. One component of the Endurance mission will attempt to continue outward survival, while another will engage directly with Gargantua. This separation is not symbolic but physical, final, and absolute. Cooper's decision to detach and enter the black hole is framed not as heroism but as acceptance of consequence. He understands that if there is any possibility of transmitting data that could solve the gravitational equation, it will only exist within the extreme conditions of the black hole's interior environment. This decision represents the ultimate sacrifice of position, time, and certainty. As the sequence transitions into entry, the boundaries of known physics begin to dissolve. The visual experience becomes abstract, reflecting the breakdown of classical understanding of space and time. Cooper's entry into Gargantua is not portrayed as destruction but as transformation into an unknown dimensional framework where conventional laws no longer apply. The mission as it existed before this moment effectively ends here. What remains is uncertainty, abstraction, and the possibility that meaning itself may continue in a form not yet understood by human science. The moment Cooper enters Gargantua, reality as it was previously understood collapses into something entirely beyond classical physics. There is no longer a sense of direction in the normal spatial sense, no clear boundary between movement and stillness, and no reliable distinction between past, present, and future. The environment is not simply extreme gravity but a breakdown of the framework through which gravity itself is normally interpreted. What was once a black hole becomes a transition into a domain where human perception cannot directly operate without distortion. Inside this region, Cooper does not experience destruction in the expected sense of being crushed or instantly annihilated. Instead, his perception is translated into a constructed environment that resembles something closer to a structured geometric space rather than chaotic singularity. This constructed space appears to function as a higher dimensional representation of time, where moments from different points in his daughter Muff's life exist simultaneously in accessible form. What he is witnessing is not a place in space but a system in which time behaves like a physical dimension that can be observed and influenced. This is where the concept of the tesseract becomes central to the narrative. The tesseract is not presented as a mystical object but as a spatial construct that allows interaction across time through gravitational or higher dimensional manipulation. Cooper finds himself inside a seemingly infinite grid of Muff's bedroom across different moments in her life. Each direction he looks is not a place but a time period. Each shelf, object, and dust pattern represents a different instant in her past. The emotional weight of this realization is immediate and overwhelming. Cooper is no longer separated from Murph by distance or even by relativity alone but by the structure of time itself. Yet within this structure, he discovers that gravity behaves differently than in normal space. It becomes the only force capable of passing information across temporal boundaries. This transforms gravity from a physical interaction into a communicative medium. As Cooper begins to understand the function of the tesseract, he realizes that he is not there to observe but to interact. The patterns he once saw in the beginning of the story, the mysterious disturbances in dust in Muff's room, are revealed to have been gravitational signals sent across time. What once appeared as unexplained phenomena becomes a closed loop of communication between different points in the same causal structure. This realization redefines the entire meaning of the mission. The black hole was not just a barrier or endpoint but a mechanism through which information could be transmitted across dimensions. The unknown intelligence that placed the wormhole near Saturn is implied to be humanity itself in a future stage of development, closing the loop of cause and effect through advanced understanding of gravity and time. Cooper's role inside the tesseract is no longer that of a traveler but of a transmitter. He begins to manipulate gravitational data by interacting with objects in Muff's room, specifically the second hand of a watch that Murph kept from her childhood. Through controlled gravitational influence, he encodes quantum data into the oscillation of the watch's mechanism, using it as a physical carrier of information that can survive transmission across the boundary of the black hole. The emotional intensity of this moment is not expressed through dialogue but through realization. Cooper understands that every moment of separation, every year of absence, and every loss experienced by Murph was part of a structure that leads to this single point of communication. The pain of time dilation is not erased but recontextualized within a larger causal loop that connects survival and sacrifice across generations. As the data transmission stabilizes, the structure of the tesseract begins to collapse. The purpose for which it was created has been fulfilled. Cooper is no longer needed as an active participant in the system, and the dimensional environment begins to release him. The experience transitions from structured control to uncontrolled descent. Cooper is ejected from the higher dimensional construct and finds himself near Saturn, rescued by a human-built structure that has developed in the time he was absent. Humanity has survived, guided by the information transmitted through gravitational encoding. The equation that allows gravitational control and large-scale space habitation has been solved, making evacuation and survival beyond Earth possible. However, the emotional resolution of the story is not completed by scientific success alone. Cooper is brought to a space station named after Murph, which represents both humanity's survival and the personal legacy of his journey. At this point he learns that Murph has lived her life, solved the critical scientific problem, and is now at the end of her natural lifespan. Their reunion is not framed as restoration of lost time but as acceptance of time that cannot be recovered. Murph, now elderly, understands the role her father played in the larger structure of events. She recognizes that the messages he sent through gravity were not abandonment but the only possible form of communication across impossible separation. Her emotional closure is rooted not in denial of loss but in understanding its necessity. Cooper, however, remains younger due to relativistic effects, creating a reversal of expected generational roles. The emotional dynamic between them is no longer father and child in the traditional sense but two individuals who exist at different points of the same narrative line. Murph encourages him to continue forward rather than remain trapped in a past that cannot be restored. After the emotional closure with Murph, Cooper is left in a state that is neither fully belonging to the past nor anchored in the present. Humanity has successfully crossed a threshold that once seemed impossible, and yet for him the victory feels distant, almost abstract, because everything he personally cared about has already moved beyond his reach. The space station represents survival on a species level, but it does not erase the individual cost that made that survival possible. Cooper's existence at this point is defined by displacement. Earth is no longer his home in a practical sense, and Murph is no longer someone he can return to in any meaningful timeline. The universe that once felt like a mission field has now become a place of quiet continuation, where humanity expands outward using knowledge gained through sacrifice and extreme exploration. Yet Cooper himself remains suspended between purpose and memory. The station where humanity now lives reflects the outcome of the equation that was solved through gravitational data transmitted from inside the black hole. Civilization is no longer restricted to Earth's collapsing environment. Instead, it has entered a new phase of expansion where orbital habitats and space-based ecosystems allow survival independent of planetary decline. This transformation represents the success of the original mission, but it also highlights the paradox that the solution required leaving behind the very people who initiated it. Cooper learns that the unknown intelligence that created the wormhole and the tesseract is not an external alien civilization in the traditional sense, but rather a future stage of humanity that has evolved understanding of time and gravity to a level where causal intervention becomes possible. This means that the entire sequence of events, including his journey, was part of a closed loop where future humanity ensured its own origin through controlled manipulation of past conditions. The concept is not presented as mystical destiny but as physics extended beyond linear perception of time. This realization reframes the entire narrative structure of the story. The mission was not simply about finding a new planet or escaping extinction. It was about completing a temporal feedback loop where survival is guaranteed through knowledge that can only be obtained by experiencing loss, distance, and sacrifice. The emotional pain experienced by Cooper and Murph was not incidental but structurally necessary within that loop. Despite this cosmic-scale explanation, the human aspect of the story remains grounded in personal consequence. Cooper chooses not to remain permanently in the station environment, because even successful survival at a species level does not resolve his internal need for connection and meaning. Instead of staying in a controlled habitat where life is stable but emotionally detached from his original purpose, he decides to leave in search of another remaining member of the Lazarus mission, Dr. Brand, who may still be alive on a distant planet. This decision represents a continuation rather than a conclusion. It suggests that exploration is not just a survival mechanism but a fundamental expression of human identity. Even after achieving interstellar capability and solving gravitational barriers, the need to reach outward does not disappear. It simply changes form from necessity to choice. The final tone of the narrative shifts toward quiet optimism grounded in realism. The universe is not portrayed as fully conquered or completely understood. Instead, it is shown as an expanding field of possibility where human survival is now dependent on adaptability rather than confinement to a single origin world. Earth remains important as history, but no longer as limitation. Cooper's departure is not framed as reunion or closure but as continuation of an unfinished journey. The emotional core of his story with Murph is complete, but his story as an individual within the universe is not. The final implication is that human existence itself is not defined by single destinations but by continuous movement through uncertainty. The story of Interstellar ultimately resolves into a structure where science and emotion are not separate forces but interconnected elements of the same system. Gravity becomes communication, time becomes a dimension of relationship, and survival becomes dependent on sacrifice that transcends individual lifespan. The universe is not softened or made less vast, but human meaning is shown to exist even within its scale. One of the most important scientific foundations behind the film is the concept of gravitational time dilation near a supermassive black hole like Gargantua. In classical physics, time is considered a constant flow, but in Einstein's theory of general relativity, time is affected by gravity. The stronger the gravitational field, the slower time passes relative to an observer far away from that field. This is not a visual illusion but a measurable effect confirmed through real-world experiments using atomic clocks at different altitudes on Earth. In the film, this principle is amplified to an extreme near Gargantua, where 1 hour on a planet close to the black hole corresponds to many years passing for observers farther away. While the exact ratio used in the story is dramatized for narrative impact, the underlying principle remains scientifically grounded. This creates the emotional structure of the entire film because it turns time into a variable that is no longer shared equally between people who are physically separated. From a psychological perspective, this introduces a condition that could be described as relativistic grief, where loss is not caused by death or separation alone, but by asynchronous time experience. Cooper experiences minutes of survival while Murph experiences decades of aging. This breaks the traditional human understanding of relationships, which normally depend on synchronized experience. The emotional pain in the film is therefore not only about distance but about time inequality. Another key scientific idea is the wormhole near Saturn. In theoretical physics, a wormhole is a hypothetical bridge connecting two distant points in space-time. If stable, it would allow travel across vast cosmic distances without violating the speed of light locally. In the film, the wormhole is depicted as a spherical distortion rather than a tunnel, which aligns with modern visualizations based on Einstein-Rosen bridge geometry. The origin of this wormhole is left intentionally ambiguous, but later implied to be future humans manipulating space-time. This leads into one of the most speculative but central concepts in the story, the idea that advanced future humanity could perceive time not as a linear sequence but as a navigable dimension. If time is treated as a physical dimension similar to space, then a sufficiently advanced civilization might be able to construct environments where past events are accessible as structured regions. This is the conceptual basis of the tesseract seen inside the black hole. Inside that construct, gravity becomes the only force capable of crossing dimensional boundaries because it is theorized in some models of physics that gravity might interact with higher dimensions differently than other fundamental forces. This is why in the story Cooper is able to send information to the past using gravitational manipulation rather than electromagnetic signals. It is a speculative extension of real theoretical discussions in quantum gravity research. From a narrative engineering perspective, this transforms gravity from a passive force into an active communication medium. Instead of simply shaping motion, it becomes a carrier of information across time. This is one of the most important conceptual innovations of the film, because it connects emotional storytelling with physical law in a unified mechanism. Another deeper layer is the concept of causal loops or bootstrap paradoxes. In the film, future humans create the wormhole and tesseract that allow past humans to survive, which eventually leads to the development of those same future humans. This creates a closed loop of cause and effect where origin becomes undefined. In classical logic, this would be considered paradoxical, but in some interpretations of relativistic spacetime, closed time-like structures can exist mathematically without contradiction, even if they challenge intuitive understanding of causality. Psychologically, this raises questions about free will versus structural inevitability. Cooper believes he is making choices under extreme conditions, yet those choices are part of a system that already includes their outcome. The emotional experience remains real, even if the structure is predetermined within a larger temporal framework. The film deliberately avoids resolving this tension, instead allowing both interpretations to coexist. On a thematic level, the story is also about information survival rather than physical survival. Earth itself is collapsing, but what ultimately matters is not the preservation of matter but the preservation of knowledge that allows continuation. The quantum data transmitted through the watch is not just scientific input but symbolic transfer of understanding across impossible barriers. This shifts the meaning of exploration from discovery of new worlds to preservation of continuity across discontinuity. Humanity is no longer just escaping Earth, it is escaping the limitations of linear existence itself. Even the emotional core between Cooper and Murph can be interpreted as a form of information persistence across time distortion. Their relationship is not maintained through constant interaction but through delayed transmission of meaning. Each message, even when separated by decades, functions as a bridge between two states of existence that cannot directly overlap. When viewed in this expanded framework, the story of Interstellar is not only about space travel but about redefining communication, survival, and identity under nonlinear time conditions. It becomes a thought experiment about what humanity would mean if time were not fixed, and if connection could still exist even when shared moments no longer align. When Interstellar is pushed beyond its narrative boundaries, it begins to function less like a story and more like a structured thought experiment about the limits of human understanding. The film assumes that intelligence evolves not just in space but in how it interprets time itself. If that assumption is extended logically, then the future beings implied in the story are not simply humans with better technology, but consciousness operating under a completely different framework of reality perception. In that framework, what we call the past is not something gone, but something permanently accessible in structure. Events do not disappear, they remain embedded in space-time geometry. This is why the tesseract concept becomes so important even beyond the film's plot. It suggests that time could be treated like a navigable landscape rather than a flowing river. If that is true, then memory and history are not mental constructs alone but physical regions encoded into the universe itself. This leads to a profound reinterpretation of communication. In normal human experience, communication requires shared time. A message is sent, then received later, but always within a synchronized timeline. Interstellar breaks that assumption by introducing a system where communication can occur across mismatched temporal frames through gravitational encoding. In a theoretical sense, gravity becomes a carrier wave not limited by electromagnetic delay or light speed constraints. Instead of sending signals through space, information is impressed onto the structure of space-time itself. If such a mechanism were physically possible, it would redefine engineering entirely. Civilizations would not build faster ships first, but deeper understanding of space-time manipulation. Technology would shift from motion-based advancement to dimensional access. The endpoint of science would not be travel, but structural control of reality layers. Another extension of this idea concerns identity continuity. In a linear time model, identity is defined by continuous experience. A person is the sum of moments connected in sequence. But in a relativistic or higher dimensional model, identity becomes a distributed pattern across time. Cooper is not just a man moving forward from Earth to Gargantua, he is a structure of decisions and emotional states that exist simultaneously in different temporal layers, all influencing each other through causal loops. Mauve's life also becomes a demonstration of this principle. Her understanding of her father does not develop through physical presence but through delayed information that reshapes her perception of reality over decades. Her scientific breakthrough is not separate from emotional truth, it is the synthesis of both. In this interpretation, knowledge is not purely intellectual but relational, formed through absence as much as presence. The emotional architecture of the film therefore mirrors its scientific architecture. Separation is not random tragedy, it is a necessary condition for information transfer across incompatible timelines. Without separation, there is no signal delay. Without delay, there is no transmission of gravitational data. Without that data, humanity cannot survive. This means that loss is structurally embedded into the survival mechanism of the narrative universe. From a philosophical standpoint, this introduces a concept that could be called structured sacrifice systems, where meaningful outcomes require embedded loss conditions. The film does not present suffering as meaningless but as functionally integrated into a larger system of causality. This does not remove emotional weight, instead, it explains why emotional weight exists at all within the structure. If we extend the logic further, the idea of future humans intervening in the past is not external intervention but self-completion of evolutionary understanding. It implies that intelligence, once sufficiently advanced, becomes capable of rewriting its own origin conditions not by violating causality but by operating within a closed temporal loop. The beginning and end of civilization become indistinguishable points on a continuous structure. At that level, the distinction between science fiction and theoretical physics begins to blur. Concepts like wormholes, time dilation, and higher dimensional constructs move from narrative devices to speculative extrapolations of real equations in general relativity and quantum mechanics. The film's realism is not about accuracy of detail but consistency of principles under extreme conditions. Finally, the emotional meaning of Interstellar at this deeper level is not about saving Earth or escaping it. It is about redefining connection when normal constraints of shared time no longer exist. Love, in this interpretation, is not portrayed as mystical force but as persistent informational alignment across separated states of existence. It survives not because it resists physics, but because it is expressed through it. At this stage, Interstellar stops behaving like a narrative and starts functioning like a framework for thinking about reality under extreme relativistic conditions. If we take its core assumptions seriously, then the universe it describes is one where information, time, and consciousness are not separate domains but interlinked layers of the same structure. One of the most important implications of this framework is that reality becomes observer-dependent not only in perception but in actual causal access. In classical physics, observers can disagree on timing but not on the ordering of cause and effect. However, near extreme gravitational environments like those depicted around Gargantua, the separation between cause and effect becomes stretched across time frames so wide that the relationship between them is no longer intuitively meaningful. What appears as a single action in one frame may span generations in another. This leads to a radical reinterpretation of agency. If a decision takes place in a system where its consequences unfold across vastly different time scales, then the concept of immediate outcome loses meaning. Instead, actions become seeds distributed across spacetime, only observable as complete patterns from a sufficiently high-dimensional perspective. In that sense, Cooper's actions inside the black hole are not isolated events but part of a larger distributed process that includes both past and future states of humanity. The tesseract concept, when extended beyond its cinematic representation, suggests that advanced intelligence would not experience time sequentially but structurally. Instead of remembering the past, such a being would navigate it. Instead of anticipating the future, it would access probabilistic branches of outcomes as spatial configurations. This removes the emotional hierarchy of past and future, replacing it with positional awareness across a temporal field. If intelligence operates in such a mode, then intervention into earlier stages of itself becomes not paradoxical but natural. What humans interpret as causality loops would be interpreted by such intelligence as system optimization. From that viewpoint, sending the wormhole, constructing the tesseract, and guiding Cooper are not separate acts but one continuous self-stabilizing operation of civilization across time. This idea also reframes the concept of survival. In ordinary biological terms, survival means continuation of an organism through time. But in a relativistic information-based model, survival becomes the preservation of informational coherence across distortions in time. Humanity does not survive simply by existing on a planet, it survives by ensuring that its informational structure can propagate through changing physical conditions. That is why the quantum data inside the watch becomes so important in the narrative logic. It is not just scientific information, it is compressed structural knowledge about gravity, encoded in a way that can survive temporal asymmetry. In a broader interpretation, it represents the idea that knowledge itself is more durable than physical civilization. From a psychological perspective, this creates a unique model of meaning. Human suffering, separation, and delay are no longer random distortions but side effects of operating inside a universe where information transfer requires delay structures. Emotional experience becomes intertwined with physics, because consciousness itself is subject to the same relativistic constraints as matter and energy. This also raises a deeper philosophical question: if future intelligence can influence its own past, then what we experience as history may actually be an incomplete view of a fully connected system. Events are not strictly gone once they pass, they may still be active within higher dimensional configurations where time is not linear. In that sense, history becomes less like a record and more like a continuously accessible structure. The emotional arc between Cooper and Murph, when interpreted at this level, becomes a demonstration of how meaning persists even when synchrony is broken. Their connection is not maintained through simultaneous experience but through delayed resonance. Each message carries not just data but continuity of identity across time separation. Their relationship functions as a bridge between incompatible temporal frames. At the deepest level, Interstellar suggests that the universe may not be indifferent to meaning, but structured in a way that allows meaning to propagate even under extreme physical constraints. Not because reality cares, but because the laws governing information allow for persistence beyond local disruption. This is where the film's scientific imagination and emotional storytelling fully merge. The universe is not softened, and human limitation is not removed. Instead, they are shown to coexist in a system where survival depends not on resisting physics but on understanding its most extreme possibilities. At this stage of analysis, Interstellar becomes less about events and more about structural reality modeling. If we accept the film's internal logic as a consistent system, then space-time is not merely a stage where events occur but an active informational framework that can be influenced, interpreted, and potentially engineered. In this expanded view, gravity is no longer just curvature of space-time caused by mass. It becomes a fundamental channel through which information interacts with dimensional structure. That means gravity is not only a force but also a kind of universal constraint language, defining how information can be distributed across the fabric of reality. This is why, in the film's logic, gravity is capable of crossing boundaries that light and electromagnetic signals cannot. If we extend this idea further, then intelligence that understands gravity at a sufficiently advanced level would not be limited to movement through space but would gain partial access to the architecture of time itself. Instead of traveling through time, such intelligence would manipulate the probability density of events within space-time, effectively shaping how history unfolds by adjusting informational boundary conditions. From this perspective, the wormhole is not an object placed in space but a controlled deformation of causal structure. It represents a deliberate modification of connectivity between distant space-time regions. That implies that what appears as intervention is actually system-level adjustment of the universe's connectivity map, something only possible if the manipulating intelligence exists at a higher descriptive level than the system it modifies. This leads to a reinterpretation of future humanity in the film. Rather than being simply advanced humans, they become a phase of intelligence that has transitioned from being inside time to operating across time as a distributed system. In that phase, individuality becomes less important than continuity of the species-level informational structure. Cooper is not an isolated agent being guided by future beings, he is a node in a larger self-referential loop where future and past states of humanity co-produce each other. In such a model, causality is no longer linear but recursive. Events do not strictly lead forward, they also stabilize backward. The origin of the wormhole and the origin of the solution to gravity are not separate points in time but mutually reinforcing positions in a closed informational cycle. This removes the need for an external first cause because the system is self-consistent across its temporal boundaries. The emotional dimension of this becomes especially important when translated into human terms. For Cooper, experience is still linear, and therefore loss is real, separation is real, and uncertainty is painful. But at the structural level of the universe, those experiences are components of a larger fixed configuration. The film does not resolve this contradiction, it maintains both perspectives simultaneously, forcing the viewer to hold emotional reality and physical abstraction at the same time. Another implication of this model is that knowledge itself becomes a form of physical intervention. In classical systems, knowledge describes reality. In the interstellar framework, knowledge can alter reality when encoded through the correct medium, such as gravity. This shifts science from passive observation to active participation in space-time configuration. The watch scene, therefore, is not just communication across time but a demonstration of information becoming physically causal. The quantum data is not symbolic, it is structurally effective. It changes outcomes at a planetary scale because it modifies what is possible within the gravitational equation. That means information is not secondary to matter, it is functionally equivalent at certain scales. If we continue extending this idea, then advanced civilizations would not primarily build structures or vehicles. They would build stable informational constraints in space-time that guide lower-level systems toward desired evolutionary outcomes. In that interpretation, civilization becomes less about expansion and more about configuration. At the psychological level, this reframes human existence as participation in a much larger informational system where individual experience is localized but not isolated. Meaning arises not from control of events but from alignment with structures that operate beyond immediate perception. In that sense, Interstellar does not end with discovery or rescue. It ends with integration into a system where survival, knowledge, emotion, and time are different expressions of the same underlying framework. At this level of interpretation, the universe depicted in Interstellar can be treated as an information-constrained space-time system where every physical interaction is simultaneously a computational event. Matter is no longer just substance but a carrier of encoded states, and every change in motion corresponds to an update in the underlying informational structure of reality. If space-time is an information field, then curvature caused by gravity is not just deformation but a reindexing of how information is locally connected. In simple terms, gravity does not only pull objects together, it reorganizes which parts of reality can directly influence which others. This makes gravity the most fundamental routing rule in the universe, determining the pathways along which causality is allowed to propagate. Under this model, the wormhole near Saturn can be understood as a manually introduced shortcut in the routing system of space-time. It does not violate physics, instead, it modifies connectivity rules between distant regions. That means advanced intelligence is not breaking the universe but editing its permissible communication graph. From this perspective, the idea of future humanity becomes less like a species and more like an emergent control layer within the same system. It is not external to physics, it is physics becoming self-aware enough to modify its own boundary conditions. This shifts the concept of intelligence from being localized cognition to distributed structural adaptation. Cooper's role inside this framework is not that of a traditional hero but that of an execution point for a system-level correction. His actions are constrained but necessary, meaning his agency is real within his frame of reference while simultaneously being part of a larger deterministic structure from a higher dimensional perspective. This dual-layer causality is one of the central philosophical tensions of the film. In such a system, time is not experienced as flow but as address space. Every event has a coordinate in space-time, and those coordinates can, in principle, be accessed or influenced if the system has sufficient control over dimensional structure. The tesseract represents this idea in physical form, a navigation interface across temporal addresses rather than a chronological timeline. Extending this further, communication across time is not fundamentally different from communication across space, it only appears different due to constraints on access. If those constraints are lifted through gravitational manipulation, then the distinction between sending a message and altering history begins to collapse. The difference becomes one of scale, not type. This leads to a deeper implication: causality may not be a strict chain but a globally consistent pattern. Instead of A causing B causing C in a forward-only direction, the entire system may resolve into a self-consistent block where all points must agree with each other across time. In that sense, the universe behaves more like a solved equation than a running process. Within this interpretation, paradoxes such as bootstrap loops are not violations but stability conditions. The wormhole, the tesseract, the data transmission, and the survival of humanity are not separate events but constraints that force the system into a consistent configuration. What appears as intervention is actually equilibrium enforcement across time. On the emotional level, this has a striking consequence: human experience becomes the subjective traversal of a globally fixed structure. Feelings of loss, urgency, hope, and separation are real locally, but globally they are components of a completed pattern. The film deliberately maintains this tension without resolving it because removing either layer would destroy the meaning of the other. In this sense, Interstellar is not just about saving humanity from extinction. It is about demonstrating that survival, meaning, and communication can exist even in a universe where linear time is not fundamental. It proposes that reality may be both deterministic at the structural level and deeply emotional at the experiential level. If we continue extending the framework established in Interstellar, the next logical step is to question whether the distinction between observer and universe is truly fundamental. In classical thinking, observers exist inside a universe and interpret it. But in a fully relational space-time information model, observation itself becomes part of the structure being observed. This collapses the separation between perception and reality at a deeper level than standard physics normally assumes. In this interpretation, consciousness is not an external lens applied to the universe but an emergent feature of the same informational system that produces space-time geometry. That means every conscious experience is not just happening inside the universe but is also a localized expression of the universe processing itself. Observation becomes self-referential computation embedded within space-time dynamics. When applied to the events of Interstellar, this idea reframes the tesseract not as a tool created by future humans but as a self-consistency mechanism of the universe allowing information loops to stabilize across temporal boundaries. Instead of future humans building it as an external structure, it can be interpreted as the universe reorganizing itself to maintain causal coherence once advanced intelligence becomes capable of interacting with time as a dimension. This leads to a stronger version of the bootstrap principle. Not only are events self-consistent, but intelligence itself may be a self-organizing feature of space-time that naturally evolves toward configurations where it can preserve and propagate information across extreme conditions. In that sense, intelligence is not accidental but structurally favored by the rules of the universe when certain thresholds are reached. If this is true, then the emergence of advanced humanity in the film is not a coincidence of evolution but a predictable outcome of informational systems that allow complexity to self-stabilize. Once intelligence reaches the ability to model time as a dimension, it naturally progresses toward influencing its own causal past because that is the most efficient way to eliminate informational loss across timelines. From this viewpoint, Cooper's journey is not an isolated narrative but a local expression of a universal tendency toward self-repairing causal loops. His actions inside Gargantua are not just survival or sacrifice, they are the mechanism through which the system resolves informational inconsistency between different temporal states of itself. The emotional dimension of the film, particularly the relationship between Cooper and Murph, can then be interpreted as the human-scale representation of this universal self-consistency process. What feels like separation and reunion is, at a structural level, the alignment of distributed information fragments across time into a coherent whole. Even grief, in this extended model, becomes a signal of partial information alignment rather than pure loss. It reflects the fact that a local observer is not synchronized with the global structure of events. When alignment is restored, such as when Murph receives the quantum data, the emotional resolution corresponds to structural resolution in the underlying system. At the deepest level, this suggests that meaning is not imposed on the universe by humans but emerges from the constraints of self-consistent information propagation. The universe does not care, but it does enforce coherence, and within that coherence, experiences of love, memory, and connection become stable patterns rather than illusions. Interstellar, when read this way, becomes a demonstration that emotional truth and physical law are not competing explanations of reality but different resolutions of the same underlying structure. One is experienced locally, the other is described globally, but both refer to the same system. At this final level of abstraction, the entire framework of Interstellar can be reduced to a single governing idea: the universe behaves like a self-consistent information structure where all events must ultimately agree across every scale of time, even if that agreement is not locally visible to the participants inside it. In earlier layers of analysis, we treated gravity as a force, time as a dimension, and intelligence as an emergent property. But in this final synthesis, those distinctions begin to dissolve. Gravity becomes a constraint on information flow. Time becomes the ordering system of that flow. Intelligence becomes the universe's ability to construct internal models of itself that remain consistent even when stretched across extreme relativistic conditions. Under this unified view, what appears in the film as wormholes, black holes, and tesseracts are not separate phenomena but different expressions of a single underlying rule: information must remain globally coherent even when locally fragmented. Every impossible event in the story becomes acceptable when interpreted as a necessary adjustment to preserve that coherence. This reframes the entire journey of Cooper not as a sequence of survival challenges, but as a traversal through layers of informational resolution. Earth represents a low-resolution state of human civilization, where survival is constrained by environmental collapse. The Endurance mission represents a higher resolution state, where humanity begins interacting directly with space-time structure. Gargantua and the Tesseract represent ultra-high resolution, where information is no longer bound to linear progression and can be reorganized across temporal dimensions. From this perspective, MOV's scientific breakthrough is not an isolated achievement but the point at which the system regains internal consistency. The quantum data transmitted through gravity is the missing piece that allows the equations of space-time to become solvable at scale. Once that consistency is restored, the system naturally transitions into a new stable configuration, humanity as a spacefaring, non-planet-bound civilization. But the most important implication of this final layer is not technological, it is existential. It suggests that separation, delay, and limitation are not errors in the system but necessary conditions for meaning to exist at all. If every moment were immediately accessible and fully connected, then there would be no structure of discovery, no asymmetry of knowledge, and no progression of understanding. The existence of constraints is what allows experience to have direction. In that sense, the emotional suffering in Interstellar is not opposed to the physics of the universe, it is produced by it. The same rules that stretch time also stretch relationships. The same gravitational systems that allow information transfer across impossible distances also create the gaps that make that transfer meaningful. When all layers are combined, the final interpretation becomes clear: Interstellar is not a story about humans escaping Earth. It is a conceptual model showing how meaning persists in a universe governed by extreme relativistic and informational constraints. It argues that even when reality is reduced to geometry, equations, and causality loops, experience still emerges as something coherent, structured, and deeply significant to the observer inside it. At the highest level, there is no contradiction between physics and emotion in the film's logic. They are simply different ways of describing the same self-consistent structure from different positions inside it. In a future where Earth is no longer a symbol of growth but a memory of decline, humanity finds itself trapped inside the consequences of its own survival. The planet that once carried civilization forward has begun to turn against it, not through sudden catastrophe, but through slow and irreversible collapse. Dust replaces soil, storms replace stability, and certainty becomes something remembered rather than lived. In this world, Cooper exists not as a hero, but as a remnant of a generation that still understood the sky as a destination instead of a ceiling. He is a man defined by contradiction. A pilot without a mission. A father whose children are growing in a world that no longer believes in stars. And yet, beneath the silence of his daily life, something remains unbroken. A curiosity that refuses to die even when the world itself has stopped reaching outward. This curiosity becomes the first fracture in a reality that has already decided to close itself. The discovery begins not with technology, but with pattern. Dust behaving as if it remembers shape. Gravity speaking in a language that should not be intelligible at human scale. A message hidden not in words but in structure. And through that structure, a path opens towards something that should not exist in a dying world, NASA, not as history, but as survival. Inside that hidden remnant of scientific ambition, Cooper learns that Earth is not failing randomly. It is following a trajectory already understood. A conclusion already calculated. The question is no longer how to save humanity on Earth, but whether humanity can leave Earth at all. And if it can, whether leaving is survival or surrender. The mission that follows is not framed as exploration in the traditional sense. It is a last attempt to connect one collapsing world to another possibility beyond comprehension. Through a wormhole that appeared without explanation near Saturn, a path exists to systems that may hold habitable worlds orbiting a gravitational anomaly so extreme it bends time itself. Cooper's decision to leave is not heroic in the traditional sense. It is a decision made under the weight of impossibility. To stay is to witness slow extinction. To leave is to enter uncertainty that may erase him from his children's lives entirely. In choosing the mission, he does not choose adventure. He chooses distance. Beyond the wormhole, reality becomes unstable in a way that is not destructive but transformative. Time stops behaving as a shared constant. It becomes uneven, stretched, compressed, fractured by gravity. Hours become years. Moments become consequences that arrive too late to reverse. On one world, the ocean itself becomes a moving expression of gravitational distortion. Waves rise not because of wind, but because space itself is pulling water into motion. Every step becomes a negotiation with physics at its most extreme expression. And while survival happens in minutes, loss happens in decades elsewhere. What is most devastating is not what is experienced in those moments, but what is not seen until later. Messages arriving not as updates, but as evidence of entire lives lived without presence. A daughter growing into adulthood while a father remains suspended in a mission that cannot return in time. And yet the mission continues, because stopping is no longer an option that carries meaning. Each world explored is not a step closer to certainty, but a step deeper into trade-offs where survival is measured in contradictions rather than solutions. On the ice world, the illusion of hope collapses under the weight of isolation. A man who once carried the promise of scientific certainty becomes the embodiment of how long-term separation distorts truth itself. In isolation, survival becomes more important than accuracy. Hope becomes more valuable than reality. And eventually, the boundary between them disappears entirely. This collapse is not just personal failure. It is a demonstration of what happens when consciousness is left alone long enough to redefine its own truth. The mission fractures again, not because of external forces, but because trust itself becomes unstable under cosmic-scale isolation. And yet even in failure, movement continues forward, because the universe does not provide pauses for correction. As the journey approaches the gravitational threshold of Gargantua, the black hole ceases to be an object and becomes a condition. A state of reality where distance, time, and identity begin to lose separation. It is here that the final contradiction emerges. To save humanity may require entering a place from which return is not guaranteed, and possibly not even meaningful. Inside the black hole, reality does not end. It reorganizes. Time becomes spatial. Memory becomes structure. And within that structure, communication across impossible distances becomes not only possible but necessary. The father is no longer separated from the daughter by years or light or distance. He is separated only by dimensional interpretation. In that impossible space, gravity becomes language. Not metaphorically, but structurally. A system through which information can pass where nothing else can. And through that system, a message is encoded not across space, but across time itself. What follows is not rescue in the traditional sense. It is completion of a loop that was never visible from the beginning. A structure in which future understanding reaches backward to stabilize a past that was always part of its own origin. When Cooper returns, he does not return to the world he left. That world no longer exists in the same form. Time has already rewritten the relationships he once had. The child he left is no longer a child. The life he knew has already been fully lived without him present inside it. And yet survival has still occurred. Not because the universe granted mercy, but because the system remains self-consistent long enough for knowledge to propagate across impossible boundaries. In the end, the journey is not about reaching another planet. It is about proving that even under the most extreme conditions imaginable, meaning still propagates through structure, through information, and through connection that does not obey simple definitions of time. And as Cooper leaves once more into the unknown, the final truth remains unspoken but present in everything that came before it. The universe does not move toward us. We move through it. And sometimes, if the structure allows it, we are still able to speak across impossible distances. Interstellar 2014 is a story set in the future where Earth is slowly becoming unlivable, crops are failing, dust storms are covering the planet, and humanity is struggling just to survive. Farming has replaced science and exploration, and people no longer believe that space travel is important anymore. Cooper is a former NASA pilot who now works as a farmer. He lives with his son Tom and his daughter Murph. Murph believes there is a ghost in her room that is trying to communicate with her through strange dust patterns that behave in a structured way. Cooper slowly realizes that something is influencing gravity in their house. This leads him and Murph to a hidden NASA base where they discover the truth: Earth is dying and humanity has very little time left to survive. NASA has already discovered a wormhole near Saturn that leads to another galaxy where potentially habitable planets exist. The only hope for humanity is to send a mission through that wormhole to find a new home. Cooper is asked to join this mission even though it means leaving his children behind. He makes the painful decision to go because he understands that saving humanity might also save his own children in the future. After traveling through the wormhole, the crew enters another galaxy where they find planets near a massive black hole called Gargantua. Time behaves differently near this black hole due to extreme gravity, so time slows down significantly in some places compared to Earth. They first visit a water-covered planet where giant waves exist due to gravitational forces. When they land, they realize that every hour they spend there equals many years passing on Earth. This means that while they are only gone for a short time in their experience, decades pass for Murph on Earth. When they return, Cooper receives messages from Earth and realizes that his children have grown up without him. Murph is now much older and feels abandoned even though Cooper never intended to leave her for so long. This becomes one of the most emotional moments in the story because time has separated them in a way that cannot be reversed. Next, they travel to another planet where Dr. Mann, one of the original scientists, was supposed to be alive. However, Mann had lied about his planet being habitable because he was isolated and desperate to be rescued. His deception puts the entire mission in danger and leads to chaos and destruction. After this failure, the crew realizes that the only way forward is to use Gargantua, the black hole itself, for a gravitational slingshot maneuver. But Cooper comes to a deeper realization that the black hole may hold the key to saving Earth through advanced physics and data about gravity. Cooper makes the ultimate sacrifice and enters the black hole. Instead of dying, he finds himself inside a higher dimensional space called the Tesseract, where time is not linear but visible as a physical structure. He can see Murph's room at different points in her life all at once. He understands that gravity is the only force that can cross time boundaries, so he uses gravitational signals to send quantum data through a watch to Murph. This data allows Murph to solve the equation needed to control gravity and save humanity from Earth's collapse. After this, Cooper is ejected from the black hole and rescued near Saturn. Humanity has now built space habitats and successfully escaped Earth. Murph is now old and near the end of her life. She finally understands that her father did not abandon her but instead helped save all of humanity. Before she dies, she tells Cooper to go find Brand, who may still be alive on another planet. Cooper then leaves again, continuing his journey through space. The final meaning of the story is that humanity is no longer limited to Earth. Time does not flow equally everywhere, and love and connection can still exist even across impossible distances and separation. Survival is not just about escaping a planet but about understanding the universe well enough to continue existing within it. After Murph's final moments, Cooper is left with a sense of both closure and emptiness because everything he sacrificed himself for has finally succeeded, but the personal cost is something that cannot be recovered. He has helped save humanity, but he has lost the normal life he once had with his family. Humanity is now living in large space habitats orbiting planets instead of staying on Earth. These stations are stable and safe because Murph's work using the quantum data from the black hole allowed humans to solve the problem of gravity. This breakthrough made it possible for humanity to escape Earth completely and survive in space on a large scale. Even though humanity has survived, Cooper does not feel like he belongs in this new world. He is younger than most people he meets because of time differences caused by relativity and his long journey through space. Everything around him feels unfamiliar even though it is technically his own species that built it. He learns that Brand, one of the scientists from the original mission, may still be alive on a distant planet alone, continuing the mission to make that world habitable. This gives Cooper a new purpose because even though Earth is no longer his home, there are still unexplored possibilities in space. Cooper decides to take a spacecraft and leave the station again. Instead of staying in a comfortable, safe environment, he chooses uncertainty over comfort because that is what he has always been part of from the beginning. His journey now shifts from saving humanity to searching for connection in the vastness of space and possibly finding Brand, who may represent the last remaining human presence in another world. The deeper meaning of this ending is that survival alone is not enough for humans. Even after overcoming extinction-level danger, people still seek purpose, exploration and connection. The universe remains vast and unknown, and humanity has only taken its first real step into it. The story ends with the idea that time, space and gravity are not barriers that fully separate people but conditions that change how connection works. Love, memory and meaning still exist even when people are separated by galaxies or decades. Cooper continues traveling into the unknown not because he has a guaranteed destination but because exploration itself has become part of human nature, and even after saving the world there is still more to discover. Cooper's journey continues into deep space with a new sense of direction but without any certainty about what he will find. He is no longer driven by saving Earth because that mission is already complete. Instead, he is driven by the possibility that somewhere out there another human being might still be alive waiting. As he travels through space, he reflects on everything that has happened, from the collapse of Earth to the wormhole near Saturn to the black hole Gargantua and the impossible space he experienced inside the Tesseract. Every event feels like part of a structure that was always connected, even if he could not see it at the time. The idea that future humans may have created the wormhole and the Tesseract becomes clearer in his understanding. It suggests that time is not a straight line but a connected system where advanced intelligence can influence earlier stages of itself. This means that what he experienced as destiny may actually be part of a larger loop of cause and effect that stretches across time itself. Cooper begins to understand that his life was never just about personal choices but about being part of a sequence that allowed humanity to survive. Each moment of loss, each separation, and each impossible event contributed to a final outcome that made survival possible for an entire species. Even though this realization is powerful, it does not remove the emotional weight of what he has lost. He still carries the memory of Murph as a child and the pain of missing her life. This emotional conflict remains even in a universe where science has explained so much, because understanding does not erase feeling. Eventually, Cooper arrives at the station where humanity now lives and realizes that Earth is no longer the center of human existence. It has become history rather than home. Humanity has adapted to space and built a new way of living among the stars. But Cooper does not stay there, because his identity has always been tied to movement, exploration, and searching for something beyond what is already known. Staying in one place feels unnatural to him, even after everything he has been through. He chooses to leave again, this time to search for Brand, who may still be alive on another distant planet. This decision reflects the core idea that even after survival is achieved, humanity does not stop reaching outward. The final message of the story becomes clear: that the universe is vast and time does not behave the same everywhere, but connection between people can still exist even across impossible separation. What matters is not where someone is, but that the structure of reality still allows meaning and communication to travel in some form. Cooper's journey does not end with arrival, it ends with continuation, because in the world of Interstellar there is no final destination, only ongoing exploration and the constant possibility that somewhere in the unknown there is still hope. Cooper's final journey is not just physical travel through space, it represents a shift in what human existence actually means. After crossing the boundary of survival as a species, when humanity escapes Earth, it does not simply move to a new location, it changes its relationship with time itself, because in the universe of Interstellar, time is not equal everywhere. It is flexible, dependent on gravity and position, which means human life is no longer universally synchronized. This creates a deeper consequence that is often overlooked. Survival is achieved, but shared experience is broken. People no longer grow old together in the same timeline in the same way. This means civilization itself becomes fragmented across time instead of just space. Cooper exists as someone who has experienced extreme time dilation, which places him psychologically outside normal human society. Even though humanity has survived, he is no longer fully aligned with the timeline of the people around him. He has lived through separation that is not just emotional but physical in the structure of space-time. This is where the deeper meaning of the film becomes clear. Interstellar is not only about saving humanity from extinction, it is about what happens when the basic foundation of human connection, time itself, becomes unstable. In normal life, love and memory depend on shared time. People grow together, age together, and build continuity through synchronized experience. But in the world Cooper has lived through, that synchronization is destroyed. 1 hour can equal decades, meaning relationships become non-linear and fragmented. Yet the film suggests something important, that even when time breaks as a shared experience, connection does not fully break. Instead, it transforms. Communication becomes delayed, memory becomes distorted, but emotional meaning still persists across the gap. This is why the Tesseract sequence is so important, not just scientifically but philosophically. It represents the idea that all moments in time may exist simultaneously as structure rather than sequence. If that is true, then separation is not absolute, it is only positional. Cooper sending messages through gravity to Murph is not just a plot device, it is a representation of a deeper idea that information can survive across time even when people cannot be present together physically. Gravity becomes a bridge between moments, allowing influence across what humans normally perceive as irreversible, past and future. When Murph finally receives the data and solves the equation, humanity does not just escape Earth, it crosses into a new stage of existence where survival depends on understanding space-time rather than resisting it. At that moment, humanity stops being purely planetary and becomes a species interacting directly with cosmic structure. But the emotional core remains unresolved because even in a universe where physics allows impossible communication, personal loss is still real. Cooper still loses the life he could have had with Murph. Murph still experiences a lifetime without her father present. This is where the film becomes deeply philosophical. It shows that understanding the universe does not cancel emotional reality, it only reframes it. Human beings can comprehend relativity, quantum data, black holes and higher dimensional spaces, yet still feel separation as loss. Cooper's final decision to continue searching for Brand represents something important. He is not seeking to undo the past because that is impossible even within the rules of this universe. Instead, he is continuing forward because existence itself is no longer about returning home but about expanding meaning into unknown regions. The deeper message becomes that humanity does not evolve by eliminating distance or time constraints but by learning how to exist meaningfully within them, even when time becomes uneven, even when separation becomes permanent. The capacity for connection does not disappear, it only changes form. So at the deepest level, Interstellar is not about space travel or black holes, it is about a universe where reality is structured in such a way that love, memory and information are the only things that can survive across all scales of destruction, distance and time distortion. And Cooper's final path into the unknown is not just exploration, it is acceptance that the universe will always be larger than human understanding, but meaning can still exist inside it regardless. At this stage of the story, Cooper's journey stops being about space, planets, or even survival and becomes something more fundamental. It becomes about what it means for consciousness to exist inside a universe where time is not fixed. When you look at everything that has happened, from Earth's collapse to wormholes to black holes to the Tesseract, the consistent pattern is not just scientific discovery but increasing access to deeper layers of reality. Each stage removes a limitation that humans once believed was absolute. First it was leaving Earth, then it was crossing galaxies, then it was surviving time dilation, and finally it was interacting with time itself as a structure. This progression suggests something important, that intelligence is not just adapting to the universe but gradually uncovering the true shape of the universe piece by piece, and that shape is not linear, it is layered and interconnected. In this deeper interpretation, the universe is not something moving forward through time, it is something that already contains all moments and allows consciousness to move through it in a limited way. Humans experience it as past, present and future, but from a higher perspective those divisions may not actually exist. Cooper's experience inside the Tesseract is the closest moment to this higher perspective. He does not see time flowing, he sees time existing as structure like space. This implies that what humans call loss is only loss from a limited viewpoint. From a complete viewpoint, nothing is ever truly gone because every moment still exists somewhere in the structure of reality. But the film also makes something very clear: even if that is true, humans do not experience reality from that higher viewpoint, they experience it locally and sequentially, which means emotional reality is still fully real even if the structure of time is more complex. This is where Interstellar becomes more than science fiction, it becomes a dual truth system where two realities exist at the same time. One is physical and mathematical and the other is emotional and subjective, neither cancels the other. Cooper represents the bridge between these two realities. He has seen the universe from the perspective of extreme physics, but he still feels time as a human. He still experiences regret, memory, attachment and longing even after understanding the larger structure. His continued journey into space is therefore not just exploration, it is an acceptance that understanding the universe does not eliminate human feeling, it only expands the context in which that feeling exists. The deeper implication of this is that meaning does not depend on stability of time or space, meaning depends on connection, and connection can exist even in unstable conditions. The film suggests that as long as information can move across the structure of the universe, then meaning can also persist even if it is delayed, distorted or separated. So at the deepest level, the story is not about saving Earth or finding a new planet, it is about proving that consciousness and connection are not destroyed by distance or time, they are only transformed by them. And Cooper's final path into the unknown is not a search for a destination but a continuation of existence inside a universe that is still being understood one layer at a time. Everything in the film is built around one core tension. Humans experience the universe in sequences, but the universe itself does not need sequences to exist. Cooper's journey shows what happens when a sequential mind is pushed into a non-sequential structure of reality. On Earth he lives in a world where time feels stable, predictable and linear. In space he enters a reality where time becomes uneven and relational. Near Gargantua he experiences time as something almost disconnected from human intuition. Inside the Tesseract he finally sees time not as something that passes but something that exists. At that point the human mind reaches its limit. Because understanding time as a structure does not automatically allow a mind to live inside that structure. This is the deepest separation in the film, not space between planets but space between perception and reality. The film suggests that intelligence evolves by expanding its access to layers of reality, but it never fully removes the gap between experience and truth. That gap is permanent. Even future humans in the story are not outside the universe, they are just operating with a more expanded model of it. And Cooper is not chosen because he is special in a supernatural way, but because he is capable of surviving that gap between understanding and experience without breaking mentally. The emotional weight of the story comes from this contradiction. The universe is explainable in structure but not fully livable in that explanation. So love, memory loss and time separation are not narrative devices, they are expressions of what happens when consciousness is forced to operate inside a reality that is larger than its own frame. And the final message is not that humanity escapes limitation. It is that limitation and understanding will always exist together. No matter how advanced a civilization becomes, it will still experience reality from inside a point of view. And that point of view will always be smaller than the total structure it is trying to understand. So the journey never ends, not because there is more story, but because perception itself is always incomplete. Human beings in the story experience reality in a linear way because consciousness is built to process information step by step. But the universe itself does not require steps. Everything that happens in the film is a confrontation between these two modes. Earth represents the most restricted version of existence where survival depends on immediate physical reality. Space represents expanded access to scale where distance and time begin to distort meaning. Gargantua represents the collapse of normal intuition where time stops behaving like experience. And the Tesseract represents the breaking point where reality becomes fully structural rather than sequential. But even at that highest level, Cooper is still inside the system, not outside it. This is the key idea. No matter how far intelligence evolves, it never escapes reality, it only increases how much of it can be perceived at once. So the journey is not movement from one place to another. It is expansion of awareness through layers of the same underlying universe. That means there is no final destination in the story. Because destination implies an outside position. And the film never allows an outside position to exist. Even future humans are not outside time. They are just interacting with it differently. And Cooper is not a chosen savior. He is a consciousness that temporarily experiences more layers of reality than a normal human mind can handle. The emotional impact of the film comes from the fact that understanding the universe does not simplify human experience. Even when reality becomes explainable, loss still feels like loss. Distance still feels like separation. Time still feels like something being taken away. This is the permanent duality the film never resolves. Physics describes structure, but consciousness experiences meaning. And neither can cancel the other. So the final truth of Interstellar is not about escape or survival or even exploration. It is this. The universe is infinite in structure. But experience is always local. And every intelligent being will always live at the intersection of those two facts. That is why the story never truly ends. Not because there is more to explain, but because there is no final perspective from which everything becomes complete. There is always another layer of reality that can be understood. And always a limit to the one trying to understand it. Interstellar 2014 is a science fiction story about the future of humanity when Earth is slowly becoming unlivable due to crop failure, dust storms and environmental collapse. Humanity is forced to focus only on survival instead of progress or exploration. Cooper is a former NASA pilot who now lives as a farmer with his children Murph and Tom. Murph believes there is a ghost in her room, but it is later revealed that the phenomenon is not supernatural but related to gravity and hidden communication patterns. These gravitational signals lead Cooper and Murph to a secret NASA facility where they discover that Earth cannot support human life much longer. NASA has already discovered a wormhole near Saturn that leads to another galaxy where potentially habitable planets exist. Cooper is chosen to join a mission through the wormhole even though it means leaving his family behind. He accepts this painful decision because he believes saving humanity is more important and might also secure a future for his children. After crossing the wormhole, the crew explores planets near a massive black hole called Gargantua. Time behaves differently near this black hole because gravity is extremely strong, causing time dilation where time passes much slower or faster depending on location. On the first ocean planet, they experience massive waves caused by gravitational forces and realize that a few hours there equals many years on Earth. This means Cooper loses decades of his life with Murph in a very short mission time. When he receives messages from Earth, he sees that Murph has grown into an adult and feels abandoned even though Cooper never intended to leave her for so long. This emotional impact shows how relativity affects human relationships. On the next mission they encounter Dr. Mann, who was supposed to be a survivor but has lied about his planet being habitable. Mann's desperation leads to betrayal and chaos, putting the entire mission at risk. After this failure, Cooper realizes that the key to saving humanity lies inside the black hole Gargantua, not just in finding a new planet. He makes a sacrifice and enters the black hole instead of trying to escape. Inside the black hole he does not die but enters a higher dimensional structure called the Tesseract, where time exists as a physical dimension. He can see different moments of Murph's life all at once. He discovers that gravity is the only force capable of crossing time boundaries and uses it to send quantum data through a watch to Murph. This data allows Murph to solve the equation needed to control gravity and save humanity from Earth's destruction. After this, Cooper is rescued near Saturn and learns that humanity has survived by building space habitats using the scientific breakthrough Murph achieved. Murph is now old and near death but finally understands her father did not abandon her but helped save everyone. Before she dies, Murph tells Cooper to go find Brand, who may still be alive on another planet. Cooper then leaves again, continuing his journey into space. The final message of the story is that humanity is no longer bound to Earth. Time and space behave differently across the universe, but connection, love and information can still exist across impossible distances. Survival is not just about finding a new planet but about understanding the universe deeply enough to continue existing within it. Cooper wakes up in a future where humanity no longer lives on Earth but inside artificial space habitats orbiting planets. Earth has become a memory rather than a home, and human civilization has expanded into space in a way that changes what human life even means. Even though humanity has succeeded scientifically, Cooper feels emotionally displaced because everything he knew has moved forward in time without him. He is technically part of the future but emotionally still belongs to the past. This creates a deeper theme that the movie builds toward, which is that survival does not automatically create belonging. Just because a species continues does not mean individuals within it feel continuity. Cooper's main conflict becomes internal rather than external. He is no longer trying to save the world, he is trying to understand where he belongs in a timeline that has moved beyond his personal experience. Meanwhile, Murph represents the opposite perspective. She has lived a full life on Earth and achieved scientific breakthroughs that allowed humanity to escape extinction. She becomes the link between human emotion and cosmic knowledge because she understands both loss and discovery at the same time. When Murph finally reunites with Cooper, it is not a reunion in the traditional sense because time has already taken most of their shared life. What remains is understanding rather than experience. They cannot go back to what they lost, but they can acknowledge what was achieved. This moment highlights one of the deepest ideas in the film, which is that time does not preserve relationships in a linear way but preserves impact in a structural way, meaning what people do continues to affect reality even after separation. After Murph's closure, Cooper is given the choice to remain in the space habitat or continue into unknown space. He chooses to leave again, not because he is running from anything but because exploration has become part of his identity. This leads to the final continuation of the story where Cooper heads toward the possibility that Brand is still alive on a distant planet alone, continuing the mission to find a habitable world. This ending reinforces the idea that the universe is still open and unfinished from a human perspective. Even after solving survival on a planetary scale, there are still unknown systems and unanswered questions. At its deepest level, the film suggests that human existence is not defined by where we are but by our relationship with time, information and connection. Even when separated by decades or galaxies, meaning can still exist through memory, action and discovery. So the continuation of the story is not about closure, it is about ongoing movement forward into uncertainty, because the universe itself has no final boundary that human understanding can reach completely. After Cooper leaves again to search for Brand, the story stops being about saving humanity and becomes about what humanity turns into once survival is no longer the problem. A species that has escaped extinction is no longer defined by pressure from its environment but by its ability to create meaning in unlimited space and time. In that stage, the universe is no longer a barrier, it becomes a medium. Distance stops being an obstacle and becomes a condition that shapes how experience happens. Time dilation, wormholes, and black holes are no longer extreme events, they become natural parts of how different regions of reality are lived. This means human existence splits into multiple experiences of time simultaneously. Some people live fast relative to others, some live slow, and some exist in environments where time almost stops. The result is not just a spatial civilization but a temporal civilization where different branches of humanity no longer share synchronized history. In that sense, Cooper is not simply traveling through space, he is moving between different time cultures of humanity where experience itself varies depending on physics. This creates a deeper philosophical shift, the idea that there is no single unified human timeline anymore, only overlapping perspectives of existence. Murph represents the grounded timeline, the one that experienced Earth and built the bridge to survival. Cooper represents the displaced timeline, the one that has been stretched and fragmented by relativity. Brand represents the future-directed timeline, the one still pushing outward into unknown systems. Together they form a split identity of humanity across time itself. The film's deeper implication is that civilization does not evolve into one unified future but into multiple versions of itself shaped by different physical conditions. And yet, despite this fragmentation, the core constant remains connection. Even when people exist in different time states, meaning still travels through actions, data, memory and influence. So the final idea is that the universe does not preserve sameness, it preserves relationships between events even when everything else changes. That is why Cooper keeps going forward at the end, because stopping would imply the story is complete, but in this framework completion does not exist. There is only continuation of structure, understanding and exploration across an infinite system that never becomes fully accessible from any single point of view. Every system in the film points toward one conclusion: the universe is not experienced as a whole but as a sequence filtered through consciousness. That filtering is what creates the feeling of time. Without a perceiving mind there is no before or after, only a complete structure of events existing together. This is why the Tesseract matters so much, not as a place but as a concept. It represents what reality might look like when time is removed as a limitation and all moments exist in one accessible structure. But even inside that structure, Cooper is still experiencing it from a perspective, which means consciousness cannot escape being localized. That is the final boundary the film keeps revealing. No matter how advanced intelligence becomes, it never becomes identical to the universe, it only becomes more aware of it. So the true ending of Interstellar is not humanity reaching a new planet or solving gravity. It is the realization that understanding reality and experiencing reality are never the same thing. Cooper's journey into deep space therefore represents something permanent in the human condition, the drive to move beyond limits that can be understood but never fully escaped. Even when humanity expands across galaxies and bends physics to its will, it will still experience existence from inside a point of view that is partial, incomplete and personal. And that is why the story never truly ends. Not because there is more plot left, but because perspective itself can never become total. There will always be something beyond what can be seen from where you are. And that gap between what exists and what can be experienced is where every story, including Interstellar, continues indefinitely. The universe in the film is structured in such a way that everything is connected through physical laws but experienced through limited perception. That difference between structure and experience is the core tension of existence. Cooper can see more of reality than an ordinary human ever could. He has witnessed time distortion, black hole physics, and even a form of higher dimensional space, but he still cannot exist outside of perception itself. This means even the most advanced understanding does not remove the fact that consciousness is always positioned somewhere inside reality, never outside it. Murph represents grounded human time where meaning is built through lived experience across a normal timeline. Cooper represents distorted time where meaning is stretched across separation, loss, and relativistic distance. Brand represents forward unknown time where meaning is projected into future possibility rather than known history. Together they show that humanity is not one single timeline but a collection of fragmented perspectives, all experiencing the same universe differently. The deeper implication is that time is not something that passes uniformly but something that is interpreted differently depending on position in space-time. And because interpretation depends on position, no two conscious beings ever truly experience the same reality in identical form. This creates a universe where absolute shared experience does not exist, only overlapping versions of it. Yet despite this fragmentation, the film suggests that connection is still possible because information can cross those boundaries even when experience cannot. That is why gravity becomes so important in the story. It is the only force that can carry information across time itself, allowing communication where normal interaction fails. But even that solution does not eliminate separation, it only bridges it temporarily. So the final truth of Interstellar is not that humanity overcomes limitation but that limitation is permanent and universal. What changes is not the existence of boundaries but the ability to move meaning across them. Cooper's final journey into space is therefore not an escape or a resolution, it is continuation without final destination. Because in a universe where time is layered and perspective is always partial, there is no final point of complete understanding. Only deeper and deeper awareness of something that can never be fully seen at once. And that is why the story cannot truly end, it can only continue being understood from different levels of distance and time.